Welcome to Better Relationships, Better Life, where relationships expert Judy K Herman and her guests share insights that can help you move through conflicts in your 9-to-5 jobs and your 24/7 lives. Crack the clarity code and create deeper connections beyond the messiness of relationships. Here's your host, Judy K Herman.
How to recognize the 5 horsemen of messy relationships. I absolutely love having guests on my podcast. There's so much energy that I have between me and my guests, and I love interviewing guests. But you know what? I'm doing a solo episode today just because I think it's time. I think it's time for you and I to have a conversation. And I'd love to talk with you about how to recognize the 5 horsemen of messy relationships. Now, keep in mind, this is not just intimate relationships, family relationships. This also happens in leadership and in teams and in organizations. So I think you're going to really have some takeaways with this. What are the 5 horsemen? Now, some of you already know that there are 4 horsemen. You're already aware of John Gottman and his research over 5 decades of the 4 horsemen. Now, that's taken, actually, people who write books on marriage or relationships will quote John Gottman's research. And sure enough, I did in my book, Beyond Messy Relationships. But I want to share with you on page 68, it's actually chapter 9 with intentional values. But I share here, by the way, the format of my book is such that it is a memoir, but it's also, I show up as a therapist at the beginning of each of the chapters to give you some insight on your relationships personally. So it's not just reading my story. And honestly, therapists who write books will write about the intense and dramatic stories of their clients. I decided to be a client in my own book. But here in chapter 9, I write at the beginning, couples who come in for therapy learn how to reverse the destructive attitudes that Dr. Gottman calls the 4 horsemen. Based upon the metaphorical language from the book of Revelation, these horsemen trot into marriages, creating the apocalypse of doom. Each of the 4 has distinct and observable characteristics. So I'm going to go through real quickly. I'm not going to go into detail because the details are here in this book, and there's others, like I said, other authors who've written on it. And the Gottmans, of course, have plenty of books about it. But the 4 horsemen that the Gottmans have talked about is criticism. And actually, these first 2 horsemen, the first is criticism, which is worse than complaints. It's a complaint with also an accusation attached to it, like you, whatever, negative. But that's what criticism is. And then we have number 2, the defensiveness horsemen. Now, criticism and defensiveness, they're like synchronized dances. I talk about also giving this illustration of playing a ping pong game. Someone will show up and be accusatory, and the other person is going to naturally defend themselves. And when then they defend themselves, then they get another accusation. And the defensiveness accusation goes back and forth as if you're playing ping pong. So my suggestion is let's just stop playing ping pong. But anyway, that's for another episode. But I just want to go over these very quickly with you. So we've got criticism as number 1. And number 2 is defensiveness. And when they show up in large parts, they are 2 of the 4 horsemen that John Gottman predicts marital doom with. And the third one is stonewalling. Stonewalling is like you're talking to your spouse and they don't even respond. They don't even acknowledge that you're in the room. It's very, very painful for the person who's trying to make conversation and have connection. But that's called stonewalling. And the 4th one is contempt. That is the one that is considered the most deadly of the horsemen because it's an accumulation of negativity and criticism upon criticism, in which you actually see your loved one, your spouse, your team member as not even having goodwill. Like you don't even see them as being good people. So I've added a 5th horseman that I wanted to share with you about. And no, it is not based upon Gottman's research, but it is based upon my own personal 40 years of marital experiences, and it's also based upon multitude of stories that I've heard in the privacy of my counseling practice with couples. What I consider this horseman is basically it's the super glue that hold all those other horsemen in place. And it's the horseman, in my opinion, that needs to leave before all these others. Have you ever had dominoes lined up like you're getting, instead of playing the domino game like you do, but you just line them up and they're standing upright and you have a long line of them and you press the first one down and all the others fall. In my opinion, it's this fifth horseman that needs to go so that all these other horsemen can get out of the way. It's the horseman that I call number 5, isolation. And it's because if all these other horsemen are in place in a relationship, there's a whole lot of guilt and shame and embarrassment. If you've got this in a family system or with couples, it's like you kind of want to present your public self. Everybody thinks you're a perfect family or a perfect couple, but then all of this other undercurrent stuff is going on and it's embarrassing and you don't want to admit that. And therefore you close yourself off. You might have a whole lot of acquaintances, but nobody really knows you and you're isolated. You isolate yourself from other close relationships, from people really knowing you, and also healthy communities. Here's an example. And now keep in mind, I homeschooled my children very early in their lives. So I'm not down on homeschoolers, okay, at all. And I hope that if you listen to the last episode, that you don't feel that that's my attitude about homeschooling. But I will tell you this, that homeschooling families, as we've heard from Natalie Hoffman in episode 43, can be rather disconnected and isolated from others. And even from other homeschooling families, it's kind of like what goes on in the family stays, and that can be isolating. So it's important to observe that and recognize that. Also, isolation could be with other extended family members, maybe other family members that you're close to over the years have gotten more distant. You don't talk with them as much because of the shame and then the embarrassment and the guilt because of the other 4 horsemen that are in existence in your family and in your marriage. And then there's these attitudes, which I think comes down from one generation to another. Nobody needs to know our business. That's nobody else's business but ours. And then there's the resistance to counseling. There's resistance on so many levels, which keeps all of these 4 horsemen intact. So as we've seen on several podcasts here on Better Relationships, Better Life, I'd love for you to go back and listen to some of them. But that lived secrecy, we've heard from Kirsten and Dave Samuel in episodes 22 and 23. We've heard also from Eddie Caparucci and having hidden addiction, a sexual addiction for many years that cost him 2 marriages. And that's in episode 30. We've also heard from Debbie Silber, who talks about the 5 stages of betrayal in episode 24. Guess what? Every one of these require that horseman of secrecy, that horseman of isolation, that disconnect. And you have to bust through that, get rid of that horseman. So all of these hinge, all of these other things in place, those 4 horsemen: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. All of those hinge on and stay alive because of isolation. That isolation horseman keeps the other 4 horsemen grazing in your relationships, in your teams. Now that you know about how to recognize those 4 horsemen of messy relationships, I'm imagining you don't want to stay in that messy relationship. Some people might be listening to this and this is overwhelming. Well, how do you even change this? I didn't know this was one of the horsemen. So John Gottman does give the antidote. What do you do about it? Now, it takes practice and it doesn't happen automatically, but it's changing some of the neural pathways of our brains and learning how to do this. This is what I help couples with, actually. But criticism, that's like, what's the antidote to it? It's a gentle startup. Rather than walking into a room or a meeting, like we wouldn't imagine walking into a meeting, would we, filled with employees and all of a sudden criticizing? maybe some of you have experienced that, but generally we don't do that, but we do that in our families. And so how to have a gentle startup, how to greet one another with gentleness and kindness rather than walking in the door and criticizing. Number 2, defensiveness. The antidote for that, simply taking responsibility, owning it. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person for doing X, Y, or Z. You don't have to be defined by the action, but taking responsibility. If you're continually or chronically late for a meeting or for meetings or for anything, take responsibility. Learn how to be on time rather than being defensive or blaming it on someone else. That's just an example. On stonewalling, learn how to take deep breaths and leaning into whatever discomfort rather than just ignoring, because that's very painful on the other side. So learn how to take deep breaths, self-soothe, and then contempt. Just build a culture of appreciation. You really can't have contempt and also be thankful at the same time. It just doesn't work. So we have to continually be aware and learn a pattern and a way of thinking of gratitude, how to be thankful. And then for the 5th horseman, yes, there's 5 horsemen in my opinion, big time: isolation. Surround yourself in an affirming community. Now, there are times in which communities you might be hanging out with are not that way. And as we did here in episode 43. So it's important to really be aware of people who just love you just like you are. I love what Mr. Rogers says. I like you just the way you are. That's what we all long for as human beings. We long to be heard. We long to be loved and accepted, flaws and all, because we are human and we do have struggles and we have flaws and we have dark sides of us. We have that shadow part of us, but we also have some goodness in us. And to be able to look in the eyes of another human being and know that we are accepted and liked, loved, just because we are who we are. I love that. That's a wonderful message from Fred Rogers, for sure. So if this seems impossible to get rid of those first 4 horsemen, here's your next step. You can start letting go of that 5th horseman. Think of the dominoes, okay? That might be the very first domino we need to knock down, the isolation. That's probably might be the easiest. Maybe for some people, maybe not for others. I understand. But if you let go of that first horseman, isolation, first of all, just take a deep breath of air. Do that right now with me. Take a deep breath and slow down. Breathe out. We take that pause, take that deep breath of air. We are actually slowing down the nervous system. We are becoming more aware. And that is exactly the acronym that I talk about in my book of breathing fresh air. The A being awareness. Now that we're aware of our 5 horsemen, right? The I is intentionality. What can you do with that? Get rid of that 5th horseman. Maybe it's a matter of, maybe it's reading a book. Maybe it's reading my book. Maybe it's reading someone else's book. But just getting out of your own head and knowing that there are thoughts and ways of being besides your own head. It might be calling up a friend, maybe a close friend that has no idea that those 4 horsemen are in your relationship. Maybe it's planning to have lunch. What's the I? So A.I.R, awareness, intentionality, and the R is the risk of growth. The R is following through, actually having that conversation with your friend and saying to your friend, those 4 horsemen are in place and I need to let you know. That's going to be the beginning of healing for so many. Not only that, it's going to really open up a lot of life for you. I'm all about living fully, vibrantly, and abundantly. And so that's why I wanted to meet with you today about all this. So these episodes, they definitely apply. Go back and listen to some of the other episodes you've not caught on yet, or re-listen to some that you have already heard. But let's keep that in mind. How can I get rid of those 4 horsemen in my relationship or my work relationships? And Yeah, they apply to business, family, leaders, and all of that. So here's your next step. I really want to remind you there is a relationship stress quiz on my website, judycounselor.com. You can go there and take the quiz and see how you're doing in your relationship. I'd love to stay in touch with you in that way, because you'll get some emails too from me and some support. All right. And then I meant to tell you this. I keep kind of forgetting about it myself, but I know it could really be helpful. On every page of my website, judycounselor.com, there is a little red tab at the side of each one of the pages, and it says Ask Judy. Just click on that. You can record your voice, leave me a message, or you can say, hey, Judy, I would love for you to talk about X, Y, or Z, or talk about this, or I'm having this, and I'd like you to address this. And then in one of the solo podcasts, or have a guest or whatever. So yes, please do that, because you can communicate with me that way as well. Or if you're interested in knowing more about how I can support you and your organization or your leadership, go to judyspeaker.com or message me on LinkedIn. You can find me those places for sure. I do want to give my utmost gratitude to Market Domination, who's producing this podcast. And also, I'm very excited because they are also part of me in the project of my producing my next book, based upon the episodes of these podcasts. I'm so excited about repurposing that content into a book, which is coming up soon. And then keep in mind, now that you know about the 5 horsemen of messy relationships, we can knock that first one out, which is the isolation, work on the others, and you can get beyond those messy relationships and get into your vibrantly authentic life. So whether you take the relationship stress quiz, leave me a message on the Ask Judy tab of my website, or contact me about how I can help your organization, I would absolutely love to hear from you. And in the meantime, please share, subscribe, comment on the streaming platform of your choice. One other thing I almost forgot to say. You can get my book wherever books are sold, and it's available on all formats, Audible, and Kindle versions as well. But if you want a author signed copy and you have a US address, I can definitely send you one. So again, go to my website. But anyway, in the meantime, I want to tell you, thank you for showing up for me today, having this conversation. I really want to tell you, you are so worth it. And I'll see you next time on Better Relationships, Better Life.